This video is sponsored by Start Playing. When the folks at Darrington Press sat down to create Daggerheart, they had quite a unique challenge on their hands. See, anytime somebody has to create a brand new role-playing game from scratch, they face countless design challenges. How is the dice system going to work? How does taking damage work? What is the setting of the game? What options are you going to make available to players? I've made videos about most of these topics for Daggerheart so far, and today is the player options video. And I want to talk about this because Daggerheart had a bit of extra pressure on it. Because they couldn't just create the character options they thought might best fit a fantasy RPG, they also knew that likely the first audience of the game would be Critical Role fans, which means players would want to be able to play character options that reminded them of some of their favorite characters on Critical Role. And so today we're going to go through the list of character options available in Daggerheart, the classes and ancestries you can play, and we're going to see which ones were directly inspired by some of the most beloved player characters and a couple NPCs in Critical Role. If you want to see more Critical Role videos, you're in luck because I have some more coming very soon, so make sure to subscribe. And if you want to see more Daggerheart videos, let me know in the comments below. I know I want to talk about the experiences system and the way Daggerheart handles character death, but beyond that, I only have some loose ideas of which topics I could talk about next, but if there's any other mechanic or aspect of the game you want me to analyze, let me know. And for those of you out there who are commenting about Draw Steel, don't worry, I see you. Not just yet, but that is definitely on my plate. I do want to talk about Draw Steel, hopefully soon. So, subscribe if you're interested in Draw Steel, but especially if you're interested in Daggerheart and Critical Role videos. Now, on with the show. First, we're going to talk about the classes in Daggerheart, and the first class is the Bard. This is obvious. It's Scanlan. Not every RPG has a Bard or Troubadour equivalent, but it would be insane if Daggerheart didn't. Scanlan is one of the most beloved characters in the history of the show. You need to offer that option to your players, and the Troubadour subclass gets you closer to the fantasy of playing Scanlan. Then we get the Druid, and that's obviously the way that you can play Keyleth. And the Warden of the Elements subclass is very clearly meant to represent Keyleth's character, since she was a Druid of the Elements. But that wasn't an option that existed in D&D. She had sort of had to make that up herself through spell choices and wild shape choices. And speaking of which, she was a Circle of the Moon Druid, and her main benefit came from having great wild shapes. But in Daggerheart, they made great wild shapes part of the core class. Everybody has great wild shapes, which is nice because Circle of the Moon is almost always everyone's favorite Druid subclass. So by just making that part of the core base design of the Druid itself in Daggerheart, you're taking that pressure off of having the favorite subclass in the same way. At higher levels as a Druid, you can transform into way more powerful animals like elephants, dinosaurs, griffins, sphinxes, dragons, chimeras. Most of that you can't transform into in D&D as a Druid unless you're using shape change, a spell. You can't use wild shape to transform into griffins and sphinxes and chimeras and dragons, but you can in Daggerheart. We don't have the ability to turn into elementals. That is the one thing Keyleth can do that we don't get to do in the Daggerheart Druid, but otherwise, if you play Warden of the Elements, you're pretty much playing Keyleth. Oh, and while we're at it, they also fixed the wild shape equivalent, so it's not incredibly overpowered anymore, because you don't just get bonus hit points that just sit on top of your normal hit points, and that's a really smart change, especially considering the way Daggerheart handles damage and how all the characters have just so many fewer hit points than you have in D&D. Giving you an extra pool of hit points that floated on top of your normal hit points would completely break the game. This was a very smart change. Next, we get the Guardian, and this is essentially our Barbarian equivalent. It's not one for one. The Guardian can wear armor and is not necessarily fueled by rage in the same way, but they do have the equivalent to the rage mechanic with their Unstoppable feature, where they can do more damage and reduce incoming damage they take. And the Vengeance subclass is a lot closer to the Rage Barbarian we know, since it's all about revenge and reprisals and having a nemesis for the day. It's not a perfect match for Grog, but it is kind of the best match in the game. If you wanted to play Grog in Daggerheart, you would play a Vengeance Guardian. Then we get the Ranger, and that's obviously Vex. One of her core mechanics, Hunter's Mark, is essentially represented in the Ranger's Focus class feature, where you always know how to find your chosen enemy, and you can cost them stress whenever you do damage to them, and you can end your focus to reroll an attack if you miss. It's a really cool mechanic. But of course, we see Vex really represented with the Beastbound subclass. And this subclass really fixes a problem Vex was dealing with when she played this class. See, just like the animal companion that you have in D&D, the Beastbound gives you an animal companion. But Vex rarely used Trinket in combat because she cared too much about him and didn't want him to get hurt. They eventually had to invent a magic item that would recall Trinket back to her locket whenever he got knocked unconscious, like a Pokemon. Even in D&D 2024, they still had to fix this problem, and they did so by making your animal companion a spirit you summon rather than a literal animal you recruited in the wilderness. So now if your animal companion dies, you can get them back through a ritual, and that is nice. But this still means that your animal companion can die, and people don't like it when their pets die. Sorry if that's a hot take, but people feel very strongly about this. They made a whole action franchise that started with, what if somebody killed your pet? But Daggerheart found a better way, I think, to fix this, where you can still have the backstory where you're recruiting an animal ally from the forest. It's not just a forest spirit in the shape of an animal. So it does, I think, a better job of capturing that core fantasy already. But also, you're not dealing with the chance that your animal companion can die. Because in Daggerheart, your beast doesn't really take damage. They only take stress. And when they would mark their last stress, they drop out of the scene. They either hide or flee from the battlefield, or something similar. So when the fight is over, your animal can just re-enter the scene and make sure you're okay. But they're not hurt in any meaningful way. Now, Daggerheart can get away with this because it is so much less simulationist than D&D. In that game, if your animal hides, they need to make a stealth roll. If they run away, you have to track their movement and see how far they can get, and if they can get away from danger in time. In Daggerheart, the story you're telling is the animal runs away. And so the mechanics just say, okay, that's what happens. So not only could you play Vex in Daggerheart, but arguably, Daggerheart is a better system to use to actually have fun playing Vex compared to D&D, and especially D&D 2014, where they hadn't yet even come up with the animal spirit fix for the problem she was dealing with. Next, we have the Rogue, and this is interesting, because obviously, Vax was the iconic Critical Role Rogue. We also had Not in Campaign 2, but she was an arcane trickster, and there's not really a subclass equivalent for that in Daggerheart. The designers didn't think that was core to the fantasy of the Rogue, and I tend to agree with that. Instead, they gave us the Nightwalker and the Syndicate Rogues. And I think they're kind of both Vax. Now, Nightwalker is the rogue who moves through shadows, and that's definitely much more in line with how Vax was played. You can step into shadows and vanish, and that definitely feels reminiscent of the times Liam would try to hide as Vax, and sometimes the situation wouldn't lend itself well to that, even though he thought he was this incredible, amazing person at hiding. Sometimes he wasn't as good as he wanted to be.
Okay, so I'm hidden behind Grog, so it should be sneak attack, and I'm the first to go, so it's a crit.
You're the first to go. It is a crit. It is not a sneak attack.
It's not a sneak attack, even though I use my bonus to hide behind Grog's big fat leg.
Where could you possibly be, Vax?
He's huge!
Where could you have possibly hidden from his sight in the middle of this giant, open, sandy arena?
He's disappeared!
And minor spoilers for Age of Umbra, but in that miniseries, we got to see Liam really having fun playing the Nightwalker rogue, disappearing in shadow and reappearing in another shadow. And I do feel like he's kind of being the mysterious Batman-style rogue that he wanted to be in D&D. That's what Daggerheart's Nightwalker rogue is. However, the Syndicate rogue is the well-connected criminal. They don't just sneak around on the battlefield, they also call on criminal contacts to help them in situations, like Han Solo looking up an old friend for help, or any of those scenes on the Blacklist where Reddington meets some internationally infamous criminal or terrorist and goes, "Ah, Hector, how long has it been? Stockholm 1997, if I remember correctly. Well, you're looking well." And theoretically, Vax was also that kind of rogue. He certainly had criminal contacts as part of his backstory. But within the game itself, at least the game we saw once they started live streaming it, he was never actually in good standing with the Clasp, or even when he was, early on, he seemed to kind of resent his affiliation with them. We never really got to see him as an agent of the Clasp using his working relationship to his advantage because that just wasn't part of his character concept. So Daggerheart kind of separates these two aspects of his character into two different subclasses you could play, and I think that's really interesting, because I think sometimes D&D struggles to figure out what the other subclasses for the rogue should even be. Maybe that's a conversation for another day, but I think it's really interesting that the second Daggerheart subclass for the rogue is really just an expansion of the criminal background trait. But I think that's something you can get away with because Daggerheart is such a story-focused game. There's just a much bigger chance that being a Syndicate rogue is going to be more useful in Daggerheart than it would be in D&D because of the way the game works and the way it assumes you're going to build your world collaboratively. So having lots of contacts is always going to matter if that's the character choice you made. Next, we get the Seraph, and this is essentially a combination of the Cleric and the Paladin, and considering how every Critical Role campaign has had at least one Cleric, I'm really surprised there's only one Divine Warrior class in the game. But maybe they felt like the distinction between Paladins and Clerics feels kind of arbitrary, and I would definitely understand that, especially considering how Pike was a Warrior Cleric, and none of the members of Critical Role have ever played a Paladin from level 1. Man, I'm really hoping that changes with Campaign 4. I just want to see somebody play a straightforward Paladin for once. Actually, I think it has been announced that that's going to be the case. I don't know if they're starting with level 1, but at least we have, I think, a straight-up Paladin, which, finally. And the Divine Wielder subclass gives you a floating weapon, so that kind of gives you the spiritual weapon spell, but really it just makes you Thor, which is cool. I like Thor. But the Winged Sentinel subclass is so much more relevant to what we're discussing today, because it's directly inspired by Pike, and that moment where she jumped in the air in her spiritual form and rolled a natural 20 and seemed to conjure wings for a moment, and so wings became a major motif of the character going forward. And obviously once Vax became a Divine Warrior himself, he also had a pretty strong wing motif. So this is the subclass to take if you want to play Pike or Vax from the second half of the campaign. Next we have the Sorcerer, and the first subclass is Elemental Origin. And this is pretty similar to Imogen in Campaign 3 with her lightning powers. And the artwork of the subclass certainly makes that parallel very direct. That's just Imogen. Technically Tiberius was also an Elemental Sorcerer, but really the other subclass, the Primal Origin Sorcerer, is a better match for how Tiberius actually played, since he leaned so heavily on all of his meta magic options, rather than doing a lot with his elemental theme besides a few occasional bursts of fire. The Primal Origin essentially takes everything that makes the Sorcerer unique in D&D, which is being able to customize spells, and makes it its own subclass. The whole idea that because you didn't learn magic from books or didn't get it from a patron, and it's just innate in how you were born, you have more freedom to experiment with magic and break the typical rules of magic. But the Elemental Origin Sorcerer, that's just Imogen. They just wanted to make that straight up Imogen, and I respect them for it. Not to say Imogen didn't use meta magic, she definitely did, but the core fantasy of meta magic is here, separated from the core fantasy of the Sorcerer, and turned into its own distinct approach to the Sorcerer, which is interesting. The Warrior is our fighter analog, and I think they do a really good job of making the Warrior and the two Warrior subclasses more interesting, so none of them are just the Champion one or the Battlemaster one. But of all the subclasses, Call of the Brave does remind me a lot of Orym from Campaign 3, specifically because Orym would start the day with rituals, a fitness regimen, and training with a sword, which always felt to me like a reference to the sword masters in the Wise Man's Fear. And the Call of the Brave subclass has a feature called Battle Ritual, where once per long rest you can prepare for an upcoming battle you know is going to be especially dangerous through some sort of battle ritual. So this, to me, feels like the Orym subclass. And finally we have the Wizard, and its two subclasses, Knowledge and War. And when I was first thinking about making this video, I felt like Knowledge was the Allura subclass, and War was the Caleb Widogast subclass. After all, the Knowledge domain is kind of flavored about recalling information, and I feel like Allura was frequently delivering exposition about lore she'd heard long ago, or tracked down off-screen. Maybe that's especially true in the era of the campaign I'm currently reviewing on the channel, but to me she felt like the best fit for that subclass, because Caleb was clearly the War Wizard. His whole thing was conjuring protection spells like shields and casting fire spells. But once again, I realized when I was actually typing up this script that this is another class where they just split one iconic character into two distinct subclasses. Because yes, Caleb absolutely would be a war wizard. He was literally being trained as a soldier, he did a whole lot of damage, but he also wound up casting protection spells. Those are both a major part of his build, and those are both key aspects of the war wizard. But then again, the knowledge wizard has a trait called Perfect Recall, and that was also Caleb's whole thing. That was a major part of Caleb's character. So once again, they took a character, a Liam O'Brien character, and they took his subclass and his role-playing flavor, and they separated them out into two subclasses. So you can kind of play two different versions of Caleb in Daggerheart, depending on which aspect you think is the most important to his character. So those are how the different classes and subclasses in Daggerheart seem to me like they were designed to represent beloved characters on Critical Role. Not all of them, but the ones that specifically remind me a lot of Critical Role characters. But what about the other major aspect of your character, their ancestry? And first things first, I'm going to set aside the fairy, the fungrel, and the ribbit. Not only do they not have any specific analogs in Critical Role, but they don't even have any major analogs in modern D20 fantasy. They're pretty unique to Daggerheart. I talked about this in another separate video, you can go check it out up there. This game also gives us the Qatari, who are cat people, and the Simia, the monkey people, neither of whom have a direct analog to any characters from Critical Role. But outside of those 5 ancestries, it seems to me like every other ancestry was specifically chosen because, well, outside of a couple that were chosen because they're D&D classics, a lot of them were chosen because they specifically have beloved associations with player characters or NPCs. And sometimes, as we'll see, they were actually specifically tailored to bring them more in line with the versions of these characters we saw in one of the Critical Role campaigns. And along those lines, the first ancestry is the Clank, and this is obvious, it's FCG. Freshcut Grass is much closer to a Clank than he is to a Warforged from Eberron. Anytime I refer to the Warforged as robots in my videos, someone will correct me and say that Warforged are a lot more nuanced than just being robots, and that's completely fair. I don't know a lot about them, or Eberron in general, so I definitely believe people when they tell me that Warforged are not just simple robots. But FCG is a robot, and so are the Clanks. They're actually very specifically designed to be immortal and designed for some specific purpose, so yeah, this is the FCG ancestry. Next, we've got the Dracona, and these are Dragonborn, and that's a part of D&D, and people are converting from D&D to Daggerheart, so you need the Dragonborn in there, but also, there have been some pretty important Dragonborn characters in Critical Role. It's very interesting to me that the version of Dragonborn we get in this game, the Dracona, that name is very close to Draconia, the fallen Dragonborn city where Tiberius is from. It almost feels like a reference to that, but on the other hand, I don't really know how many other words you could come up with for a dragon man, so it may not have been completely deliberate. Then we've got the dwarf and the elf, staples of D&D, so you're going to have them here, of course, as well. Although, in fairness, you also kind of need the elves so you can play half-elves, because in Daggerheart you can just decide to be a combination of different ancestries. And for half-elves, we get Vex, Vax, and Keyleth. And dwarves, we get Keg from Campaign 2. Then we've got the Fawn, and that's Fern from Campaign 3. The game gives you a lot of flexibility, so you can be more goat-like or more human-like, depending on your own preference, but even the artwork itself looks a lot like Fern. Then we have the Furbolgs, and honestly, this ancestry is one of the major reasons I wanted to make this video at all, because the evolution of the modern Furbolg in the context of Critical Role is honestly pretty fascinating. See, this is what the artwork for the Furbolg looked like when it was introduced in D&D 5e, very much a gentle giant. So when Matt first introduced a Furbolg NPC into his game, he used this artwork as inspiration for how he described the character. And in his description, he described the character as having a layer of gray fur across his skin and a cow-like nose, which, okay, I can see how he got there. But Liam got a very different mental image in his head. I think he misunderstood and thought that this character was basically a cow person. And so when he started interacting with the NPC, he made a comment about glancing up and noticing his horns. Matt had never mentioned horns. Furbolgs don't have horns. But now this one did. And with that, the fan artists were off to the races. Especially because for a lot of them, they weren't playing D&D with this new supplement that had just released Furbolgs, and they're not very well known in fantasy in general. So this was the first exposure many of them had to Furbolgs, and so they were basically going off of their interpretation of Liam's interpretation of Matt's interpretation of Furbolgs. And so now the version of Furbolgs that show up in Exandria were always going to be described as cow people from now on forever. So that explains the artwork we get in this book, continuing that design sensibility through this game. Additionally, the Daggerheart Furbolg has a trait called Unshakable, where they just have a chance they won't take as much stress as other characters. And this feels like a clear and very deliberate reference to the fact that almost all the Furbolg characters on Critical Role have almost uniformly been incredibly chill and generally unflappable. So of course you give them a mechanic that makes them a little bit less likely to take stress. That's how they brought the Furbolg more in line with the Critical Role interpretation of a Furbolg. However, the other trait Furbolgs have in Daggerheart is a charge. They have a charge ability because the game tells us that some Furbolgs have even more bovine heads, complete with horns, and we typically refer to those as Minotaurs. It's interesting that these are two distinct creatures lumped together into one ancestry, but I think it makes sense for two reasons. First, if Furbolgs have already become cow people in the world of Critical Role, you may as well just fold the bull people into that as well. Makes sense. But second, let's imagine you're developing this game, and you're trying to make sure that a lot of the major ancestries from Critical Role are represented in your game. And then, very late in the development process, something happens during the current campaign. And suddenly there is a major Minotaur player character. Thankfully, you have enough time where you can add a detail to the ancestry for the Furbolg where you can now use that same ancestry to play a Minotaur. So you can still play this new character that was just introduced in the campaign. It's a pretty clever solution, especially considering you already have cow people in the game. All you need to do is give them a charge attack, and you're good. Now they can be Furbolgs like Caduceus or Pumat, or they can be Minotaurs, like that new character. And I think, I don't know this for sure, of course, but I get the feeling that's what happened behind the scenes that led to the Minotaur being incorporated as a playable ancestry in Daggerheart through the form of the Furbolg. Next, we've got the Galapa, based on the Tortle from D&D, and there's never been a Tortle player character in any of the Critical Role campaigns, unless a guest player played one later in Campaign 3, beyond the point I've seen. That's possible, but as far as I know, that's not the case. But there was a very well-loved Tortle NPC in Campaign 2, and he was actually created by the community during a fireside chat with Matt, so I think he is very important to the community. Plus, Sam used to play a Ninja Turtle on TV. Maybe that's why you can play a Tortle in Daggerheart. Probably not, but you never know. Next, we have the Giants, and it's very interesting to me that this seems like this is their way of incorporating Goliaths, but while also making sure they're staying completely clear of D&D's intellectual property. Obviously, Wizards of the Coast doesn't own the word Goliath. It does predate D&D by quite a bit, but if you use that word in your own game for a race of half-giants, you are going to draw some looks from the copyright team at Wizards of the Coast. Plus, while Daggerheart does allow you to play characters who are products of two different ancestries, like half-elves and half-orcs, those are not the default ancestries in the book the way they were in 2014 D&D. So it'd be really weird if there was just a half-giant race, when you could just instead make them giants. After all, you could play as a fairy or a little frog boy, so this game's roots are a little bit more explicitly fairy tale-esque rather than the default high fantasy we get with D&D and most of its contemporaries. The idea that you can play a giant is kind of compatible with that approach. Plus, it means you can play Grog as either a half-giant or as a giant and make him the biggest and toughest dude in the world, because he's not a half giant anymore. He doesn't have to be, at least. Next, we have the Goblin, and that's not the Brave from Campaign 2. Then we have the Halfling, and not only is that a classic ancestry from D&D, directly inspired by the Hobbits of Middle-earth, but also this is how you can play Veth or Orem. And then, of course, we have the Human. You've got to have a human, and there have been more than a few humans on Critical Role as well. In fact, this is a bit of a fun fact, but all of the Critical Role players are human. Weird coincidence, I know, but it's true. I've checked. All of them are human, except for guest player Emily Axford. She's a demon sent from hell to kill Brennan Lee Mulligan. And speaking of which, the next ancestry is the Inferni, the tiefling by another name, the Fiend from Hell. This is obviously how you can play Jester or Molly. The artwork even looks exactly like Mollymauk, and his attire is lifted directly from Kingsley, another tiefling character later in Critical Role. And finally, we have the Orc, a reference to Ford, who was a half-orc. And in that campaign, we learned that Ford has to file his tusks, or they'll keep growing and become more pronounced. And we get that represented in the Daggerheart Orc, who can get some incredibly interesting looking and detailed tusks, far more so than I've seen in any other artwork of orcs from D&D in general. That feels to me like a reference to what they've established about Ford's tusks. And so these are all the character options the designers chose to incorporate, with an emphasis on the ones that specifically reflect some characters from Critical Role. But what's missing? Well, one of the most glaring omissions to fans was the gnome. There's no gnome, so you can't play Pike or Scanlan or Chetney. Except, obviously you can. The halfling is close enough that it really doesn't matter, at least I'm sure that's what the designers thought, but that's not how the fans responded. Critical Role fans, not famous for loving change. Same with RPG fans, actually. Whether it's because they come from D&D in general, or they came to the game as fans of Critical Role, a lot of players in Daggerheart liked the idea that gnomes are distinct from halflings. So the designers behind Daggerheart put a gnome up on the Void for playtesting. I haven't taken it for a spin yet, that's true for all the Void stuff we're about to talk about, so I don't know how it compares to the halfling, or more specifically, how well it sets itself apart from the halfling, but I guess we'll find out over time whether they find a version of it that they think is distinct enough that it justifies being its own ancestry. Maybe they could have saved themselves some trouble by incorporating the gnome into the halfling's lore the way the Minotaur became part of the Furbolg, but we'll see what happens. We also don't have a gunslinger like Percy, but that seems to have been a much more deliberate decision. I think they wanted to offer the gunslinger as an option that was setting specific. The Colossus of the Drylands campaign frame specifically offers rules for firearms. If you're playing in Exandria, post-Percy, and firearm technology is starting to make its way around the world, you can just use the rules from Colossus of the Drylands. If you're playing in a standard medieval fantasy setting, the designers don't necessarily want to give you a gunslinger class or subclass because it might not feel compatible with your campaign setting, and they don't want the player to just sit down at the table with a class that doesn't make sense for your world. So that feels like a very conscious omission rather than an oversight. We don't have a monk, a hand-to-hand fighter who doesn't use weapons, and that was Bo's big selling point. I personally wonder if maybe the designers didn't just imagine you would play Bo as a Call of the Slayer warrior, but once again, they've heard the response. Players want to play a martial arts character, so they put one up on the Void. Originally called the Fighter, but that was confusing, so now it's the Brawler. And I really like that they're decoupling this class from its martial arts movie roots. You can still play that kind of Brawler if you want, but it's no longer steeped in Orientalism the same way the monk has been for so much of his existence across D&D's history. And that's a much easier change to make when you're first developing the class. It's much harder to later strip that sort of material out of an existing class that was already designed with that mindset in mind. There are a few other characters from Critical Role where I'm not sure which Daggerheart class you would choose to play them. Yasha and Ashton come to mind. You could make the case that either one could be a guardian or maybe a warrior. You don't really have Mollymauk's Bloodhunter, but that's actually being playtested right now as well. It's possible they were worried that this class was going to be in a legal gray area since it was originally designed for the DM's Guild, and they've pretty much been prohibited from reproducing it in any other Critical Role D&D supplement as a result. But it seems like they must have figured out the path forward so they can start developing that class, and now it's going to be up on the Void if it's not already. Plus, that might be another class where they didn't feel like it belonged in the core fantasy of Daggerheart, but would be at home in one of their upcoming supplements, because we do know that Jeremy Crawford and Chris Perkins are working on a more horror-themed campaign setting right now. I would not at all be surprised if that's where we get to see the Bloodhunter finally published for Daggerheart. And finally, we have the Warlock. And this is probably the most surprising omission, at least to me. We had two major Warlock player characters, Laudna and Jester, but we also had Percy, who wasn't literally a Warlock, but thematically, yes, he was. That's being playtested right now as well, and I do wonder why they held off on putting that one in the main book. It might literally be that the only way to make the Warlock work would be to add another domain, which really complicates things because you would need to add another class as well that had some other thematic connections to the Warlock, so you could justify that new domain, and at that point, you're also starting to push how much content you can fit in the book, and to say nothing of the fact that they might have a limit on how many cards they could print, and the Warlock could have tipped them over that limit. Plus, maybe that's another class where they didn't want to determine that this is how the world works for the base version of the game. Maybe they always knew they wanted to do a horror supplement later with some spooky character options, and maybe they were always saving the Warlock till they got to that point. Again, I'm purely speculating. We don't specifically know why they didn't include the Warlock yet. But it's available for playtest right now, and part of me is really excited for the day they do put the Warlock into a proper Daggerheart supplement, because, man, I would love to see what kind of mechanics they suggest for how your player character can have a relationship with their patron. That's going to be so juicy mechanically and narratively. Also, I just want them to fix the Warlock. I hate the D&D Warlock. I need spell slots. I can't... Man, you gotta give me my spell slots, man. I gotta have my spell slots. Do not talk to me until I've had my spell slots. Now, maybe you haven't had a chance to play Daggerheart yourself because you just haven't been able to put a group together. Anytime people want to play a new game, I see so many stories online of people really trying to gather a group but having a hard time finding other players. I've been through the same thing so many times. You have games you want to play with people, but your regular players either don't have the time or they aren't sure if they want to try a new game. But there is a whole community of people out there who do want to play new games, and they even want to run new games for you. But how can you find them? How can you make sure they're interested in the same type of games that you want to play and the same play style you want from those games? Well, you can check out today's sponsor, StartPlaying.games. Start Playing is a fantastic resource you can use to find groups playing just about any RPG under the sun, and find GMs who are paid to run the games you're looking for. You can browse the search page for games that fit your schedule and style, and find hundreds of game masters with verified reviews from real players. You can find exactly the campaign you want to play in for whatever time slot works for you, and over 80,000 players have already found their party on Start Playing. I've used Start Playing before, and honestly, one of the biggest selling points of the service for me is that you are so much more likely to find a consistent and reliable group through Start Playing, because everyone signing up for the game has agreed to be there, and they're not just treating it as a casual game night. They're financially committed to this game as well, and they're going to make it a priority. So visit startplaying.games today using the link in the description and find the gaming group you've always wanted. Thank you so much to Start Playing for sponsoring this video. Thank you so much for watching, and thanks for your patience as I was offline last week. I filmed a few videos that wound up requiring way more editing than I expected, and so it just made sense to push them back to this week instead.
Oh, did it now?
Yeah, Oddwick, it did make more sense.
This is not what we agreed to.
Well, look, Oddwick, sometimes my videos take a little extra time. It's not a big deal. Don't worry, I've still got plenty of videos in the work, including a big, beefy Demystified video for Critical Role episode 81. Don't worry, you are going to be more than happy with that one. Plus, there's going to be a lot of Critical Role videos coming out this week from me, actually, which is going to sync up well with Campaign 4, which starts this week. So, you know, it's going to have some nice YouTube synergy going on.
You mean SEO?
There might be some good SEO this week, yeah.
Well, good. Because this is the second time this year you've promised weekly Demystified videos and then haven't delivered them.
Well, I'm not sure it counts as a promise when you've literally cast a curse on me, making me make these weekly videos, but yes, it's fine. You are going to get your weekly Demystified videos.
Hooray!
And so if you want to see all these videos whenever they come out this week, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell and leave a comment. Do all the YouTube stuff. You know the YouTube stuff. You know how it works. If you want to help the channel financially, you can sign up for my Patreon. That honestly helps even more than I can say. And if you think this video was neat, I'd love if you could share it with a friend. That always helps a whole lot. And if you want to see more Daggerheart content, check out this video about discussing the ways Daggerheart is a narrative-first game compared to D&D. Until next time, play fair and have fun.